Afternoon, friends and comrades. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education, or CPE. I'm joining you back home in the lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. As usual, the chat will be disabled for these calls, except for us to share information with you, our audience. And so if you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try our best to answer them there. In that same toolbar, you can find the CC button to enable closed captioning, and a reminder to support these PSAs. You can donate to the link that will be provided in the chat by Annie. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome back to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area and across the country. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with us. As usual, just try and share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends, and the recordings are available on CPE's YouTube channel. This past weekend in Chicago, Center for Political Education and the Arab Resource and Organizing Center co-hosted a session at the Socialism Conference with our dear comrade Roshan Dadu of the South African BDS movement. The goal for our session was to reflect on what it means to put anti-colonial theory into practice, specifically how the Palestine Solidarity Movement has grown, even as we've failed to stop this monstrous genocide in the short term, and what's required for us to be more effective in the short and long term to end this murderous rampage and free Palestine. In the lead up to that session, we heard from Noura Erakat and Linda Sarsour at the conference plenary about the agonizing reality of being in Palestinian leadership in this moment, witnessing the world stand by as your kin, including children, are gathered up in pieces and placed in indistinguishable plastic shopping bags. Yet despite this incalculable cruelty and the hard lessons about the failures of the international order to fulfill the promise of human rights and to protect humanity, Noura and Linda still pointed to the incredible power of Palestinians in Gaza and in the diaspora, who've created an unprecedented international movement for global peace, despite every racist attempt to invisibilize it. As a result, as Noura said during her comments, Zionism, quote, has no moral legs left to stand on, and the unchecked aggression of Israel and the Zionist movement only signals their fundamental weakness. Heading into our session, Roshan, Samar, and myself were unsure what to expect, given the amount of programming on Palestine that had already preceded us. But our session was packed, and when we made our space available for attendees to break into small pairs and reflect themselves together on what the Solidarity movement had done and what strategic tensions were still left in our path forward, what emerged was extremely salient. Acknowledgement that we had turned a corner in the fight against Zionism, despair that a ceasefire still felt far off, frustration with political litmus tests and the inability for comrades to hold the contradiction of inside and outside strategies, and just as much, simmering rage that more wasn't being done to really push for disruption from the outside, particularly given the betrayal of democratic leadership. It was a testament to how involved everyone in that session, coming from across the country, has been in Palestine solidarity work that most, if not all, the attendees had some strategic insights, case examples from the ground, and genuine questions about how the movement was being advanced and where it was heading. There were some general political disagreements that began to surface towards the end of the session, but all of it still pointed to the inarguable reality that these were people invested in a movement. As our comrade Max Albaum has recently written in a nice reflection on the position of the movement at this juncture and the relationship between inside and outside approaches in this most recent piece in Convergence magazine, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, quote, is at the cutting edge of the fight for peace, respect for international law, and a shift away from global domination and militarism as the anchors of U.S. foreign policy, end quote. And I'd add that all of that is true, even as various political forces within this movement have not insignificant disagreements on strategy and tactics. Just the night prior to our session, Roshan, Samar, myself, and a few other comrades were welcomed at Nabala Cafe, a new Palestinian establishment in Chicago. We had delicious peppermint cardamom tea, had a lovely conversation with their staff, and were embroiled in a fierce game of bananagrams, yes, bananagrams, that involved numerous specious claims to victory. That place was packed on a Saturday evening for a game night, and the atmosphere was welcoming and genuine. We learned later that the following evening, someone had attacked the cafe and broken a window in an act of anti Palestinian vandalism. We also learned that when Nabala asked for support from the community to replace that window, which cost about $2,500, they received over $10,000 in just a few days, the balance of which they donated to Middle East Children's Alliance, or Mecca. The whole episode encapsulated so much of what we're experiencing at this moment: vicious attacks on the peace and livelihoods of our Palestinian siblings, and a robust response from a community, a growing community, in solidarity with their struggle. This is critical for us to remember at this juncture, when the end goals seem far and those that should be near, like a ceasefire, feel as if they are constantly being pulled from our grasp. This is a movement with leadership and scale, and disagreements, and things to work out on the inside and the outside. It should be doing more. It has gained capacity to do more. It will take time, and we also don't have time to wait for a ceasefire. These are the numerous contradictions we are wrestling with while maintaining our fervor and love for a shared humanity. As our comrade Roshan encouraged us during our session when reflecting on the connections between South Africa and Palestine, quote, "You can't exactly know what will happen, but you can act on certainties around you and your political belief that we know Palestine will be free. And that requires hard work. It's not going to fall from the sky. So we need to look at how did we do this in other struggles? What were the conditions around that? What's similar? What's different? And I think we need all forms of struggle." Thanks again for joining us for this PSA. And let's bring up Melissa to ground ourselves in this moment before we bring up Samer to go over this week's news and analysis. Melissa, welcome back.
Thank you, Thomas. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Contradictions. Let's ground in our contradictions. Let's practice who we need to be in order to hold the contradictions of this moment so that we can act with our principles and within community. Finding yourself as you are right now in your body, just begin to notice your breath. Noticing if you're feeling any tension in your body, any areas of ease or neutrality. Noticing if you're feeling numb, irritated, confused, excited, hopeful. Anything and everything that you're feeling is welcome. And as you're noticing here, begin to bring your conscious awareness down to your feet, to your lower extremities. And seeing here, if you can just toggle back and forth, left and right, tapping your toes or wiggling your toes, wiggling your legs, left, right, left, right. Inviting further presence into your body right now. And as you're doing this, bring to your body a moment of holding contradiction. Maybe it's something that happened in the past, or maybe it's something that's happening right now. We are trying to bring about the downfall of empire, of this particular empire that we live in, which hasn't been done before. And all of us here who live in the so-called United States are products of this conditioning of empire. How do we bring about the end of something that we are born in? How do we practice what's necessary for collective liberation when that's not something that we are taught? This is a very basic contradiction that each of us has to hold as we move forward. Setting ego aside, knowing that each of us makes mistakes and we try together. And noticing now, returning back to your body, what this feels like internally. Simply noticing if there is discomfort. Noticing that you can hold discomfort. And taking another deep breath together. Rounding one more time down into your feet. And I invite you for the rest of this call or the rest of this week to just hold this in your heart, in your mind, in your body, the contradictions that we have to move through together to achieve free Palestine. Thanks for practicing with me today.
Melissa, thank you. As always, it's great to have you with us to ground us, Samar. It would be great to have you come up now. I think we just spent a few days together in Chicago. It was a lot of conversation around Palestine and some sort of like big picture reflections coming at this juncture just a few months before a pivotal election, and also at a time when we're seeing you know increased activity in the West Bank, all sorts of protests and mass mobilizations within Israel, and pushing for some sort of deal to be done. I know you shared with me some of the um, efforts to get the U.S. government to move independently of Israel. A lot to go to sort through, but I'll leave it to you to kind of take us through it, and maybe at some point we can also reflect a little bit on what we've been hearing, just in terms of these convening spaces where folks have been gathering, over the last couple of months, to reflect on where we are as a movement.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be back. Also good to be doing it from my home, which has been, I think, over a month or so. So it's good to not be on the road and actually have the time to sort of sit with the various things. So might as well just get started. Um, so starting right at the top, there's been a lot of talk about these polio vaccine pauses, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail, but just to say that that doesn't mean that this has not been a violent week in Gaza. The Israeli military has, of course, been engaged in a pretty brutal campaign across the Gaza Strip this past week. The official death toll has gone up by about 300, but the unofficial one is obviously significantly higher. So doing what we usually do, which is starting at the bottom of the Gaza Strip and working our way up. Starting with Rafah, the big news from the week, of course, from this past weekend was the discovery of the six Israeli prisoners that were killed on Sunday. I think like days or hours before a potential rescue operation could have found them. This is something that, as far as I understand it, Hamas has acknowledged and claimed responsibility for. So they did note that that Hamas had ordered the execution of those prisoners. The piece of this that I feel like never really made it properly into U.S. media effectively was a statement that they issued around the reason for that and tying it directly back to the Nusayrat hostage rescue operation that happened a few months back, where the IDF, went in and I think like 200 some odd Palestinians were killed in this hostage extraction campaign. And coming out of that, basically Hamas said, as a result of that, and as a result of like the way that the Israeli military is like wantonly massacring Palestinians in the course of these like hostage rescue operations, we've changed our operating guidelines around how we deal with the prisoners that we have when we feel like the IDF is approaching. And that's exactly what happened this past week. Which, for folks who have been coming to the PSAs for a while now, is a thing that we've talked about quite a bit, that like that giant hostage operation that released those few Israeli hostages was likely to be the very last one that the IDF would be able to do. And that's basically been borne out because Hamas is obviously going to change the way that it's managing its sort of operational response to those sort of tactics. And we're seeing the manifestation of that now. So, yeah, so like the giant outcry that folks had around the death of those six prisoners, which, putting aside the fact that 47 Palestinians died that week, and no one really seemed to bat an eye about that piece, but the uproar over the six, I think, was in many ways correctly considering the fact that like the Israeli government, knowing that this was the logical endpoint of these sort of like high risk military operations to rescue hostages, has like gotten the situation to this point, which was why I'm sure folks saw like the giant general strike and other big actions inside Israel, like the largest protests to date, basically pushing the Netanyahu government to agree to a ceasefire. Basically, the rallying call of those strikes was any deal, right? Like on any terms, get the rest of the hostages out. And it doesn't really seem to have moved Netanyahu in any meaningful way, unsurprisingly. But like a general strike across all of 48 is a pretty big deal. And it's worth noting that while the overwhelming public opinion inside Israel has turned very decidedly against the ongoing military operation, that's mostly coming from a place of concern for the Israeli prisoners, obviously not for the loss of Palestinian life, or the like concern for the sort of overall carnage that's being caused. There's a shocking Pew survey that came out this week of Israeli adults who, like by a 2-to-1 ratio, thought that social media content that expresses sympathy for civilians in Gaza should be banned. Which like a wild number, but as a reminder of the sort of like late stage colonialist nature of that society at this point, where there's just like a foundational inability to recognize the humanity of Palestinian people. But that's a aside, and I think we'll come back to later. So we were in Rafah, moving up. Khan Yunis has been sort of the ground zero operations for the vaccination campaigns, where there was this really deadly assault over the past month or so that ended a couple weeks ago. That vaccination campaign has been a bit of a mess. The Israeli army continues to block medical teams from polio vaccination campaigns. That's largely happening in Khan Yunis, but also sort of like spread out through the strip. Similarly in Deir al-Balah, which is just north of Khan Yunis, where like the fighting is ostensibly like in Khan Yunis on pause because of this polio vaccination campaign. What we're seeing is the IDF claiming that yeah, like the military assault is on pause, but we are doing counterterrorism operations, and so these like special forces operations along with the Air Force, so bombings are still being carried out in areas where there's supposed to be a sort of stop because of the polio vaccination campaign. In Gaza City, I think developments there show sort of the two trajectories that the ongoing genocide in Gaza is creating. On the one hand, we see the sort of continuing Israeli assaults on like civilian centers, this sort of like ongoing campaign of just somewhat indiscriminate bombardment of areas designed to like degrade the infrastructure in this sort of like long-term Israeli military tactic of sort of continuing to just like degrade the structures in Gaza as much as they can. And the natural, unsurprising consequence of that, which is the inability of those sorts of campaigns to actually reduce military resistance to the Israeli military, which is ongoing and by some analysis strengthening. So we're seeing like, in a conversation that we've had many times on this PSA before, the ways in which the Israeli military moves in, attacks, withdraws, and then that results in a sort of recruitment drive for Hamas, which only ends up rebuilding their forces faster. So it's an unwinnable game, but everybody knows it's an unwinnable game. So this is a sort of like fiction idea that's sort of designed to drag out the process because, again, Israel's in an unwinnable war in Gaza, and so it really doesn't have much of a choice other than to accept defeat, which it won't, or just keep going and hope for some sort of change on the ground, which, again, not going to happen. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, things seem to be escalating significantly. We talked a lot last week about the escalations in the West Bank, and this week it's somehow gotten even worse. The operations in Jenin have been super intense. They're now officially classifying the West Bank as a combat zone, meaning that basically free license for the IDF to do everything that they were doing in Gaza in the West Bank. And, as a reminder, the West Bank is an area where the existing governance systems are already tracking down and killing anyone who's purported to be a member of Hamas. So like this obviously isn't an anti-Hamas operation, it's just an anti-Palestine operation. As I've seen, they've destroyed something like half of the streets in Jenin and have displaced, I think, 40% of the population. What we're seeing is, we talked last week too about the ways that the discourse around Gaza is now being applied to the West Bank. And the sort of natural endpoint of that is the conversations that the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has been having this week around mowing the lawn in the West Bank, which is generally a phrase that the Israeli military has been using in Gaza for decades now. The idea being that you don't want the population to get too big, and you also don't want the military forces to feel too capable of attacking Israel. So there's like a constant regularized effort to attack and degrade civilian infrastructure in those areas. So now they're saying we're mowing the lawn in the West Bank, and Gallant on top of that is saying, actually, that's not enough. We need to pull out the roots. So a lot of the sort of like large scale infrastructural devastation that you're seeing in the West Bank is clearly aimed at sort of like broad civilian degradation. And an attempt to sort of clean the area to establish new Jewish settlements. There's no question that that's part of the process. You can see just like the effort to destroy basic infrastructure in the West Bank is clearly part of the underlying calculations here. The other West Bank news just from this past day was the assassination of a U.S. citizen in the West Bank who was attacked by a sniper. Aishanur Egi was there with the International Solidarity Movement, and through a series of eyewitness accounts, was just like directly targeted and assassinated by a sniper. She was just standing on the street, doing the sort of general ISM, nonviolent, standing in the way of land evictions and land theft. So um, it's a really horrifying story. I'd encourage folks to read about what happened to her. It's quite devastating. Um, and I think the folks who were there with her, her comrades on this trip, uh, did a wonderful job of contextualizing like her murder in the context of all the other murders that have happened to folks who have been protesting the Israeli occupation in the West Bank for many years now. That area around this specific illegal settlement of Evyatar, if that's how it's pronounced, I believe just shy of 20 people have now been killed protesting in that area. So near Nablus. So this is nothing new, but we'll see whether the United States government seems to care anywhere near as much about the U.S. citizens that are killed when they're Palestinian U.S. citizens as opposed to Israeli U.S. citizens. In Lebanon, after the really big sort of fiasco of, Israel attacking purportedly thousands of rocket launching sites and then Hezbollah launching hundreds of missiles into Israel, there was a sort of both sides claiming victory and saying that this would lead to a de-escalation from that point, but that's really not what we've seen at all. In fact, we've seen an increasing rate of missile fire in both directions. So that like hot border continues to be the sort of concerning point of potential high level escalation. There are talks currently being held, and in like a very typical U.S. colonial fashion, the talks about tensions with Lebanon are being held between the United States and Israel largely. And then Biden's special advisor to Lebanon, Amos Hochstein, who we've talked about before, looking for ways that a sort of like agreeable settlement can be reached that can tone down the level of conflict on that border. It's worth noting, I think, based on this Axios article, and again, whenever I see an Axios Barak Ravid scoop, we should just understand that as something that the Biden administration is purposely leaking, not a real meaningful scoop. But if folks read the article, the things that stand out, I would say, are twofold. One is that the basis of the agreement is for a particular Hezbollah brigade, this like very like high capability special forces brigade, to move 10 kilometers north from the border, so like to create this space, which is a reduction of Israel's original demand, which was no Hezbollah forces within 10 kilometers of Israel. So there's a sort of like, moving towards a recognition of what's actually conceivable, although I don't think even that ask is very likely to be meaningfully implemented. So that's part one. And then part two, talked about very openly by the US officials involved in this process, is that they need this Lebanon border to cool down so that they can move forward with the Saudi normalization deal. So that continues to be the sort of like crown jewel of the US approach to this, the idea that somehow restoring the Israeli-Saudi normalization process will resolve these issues, whereas obviously I don't think it really fixes anything at all. And it also doesn't feel very likely in this moment, but with the Saudis, who knows? As for where the ceasefire seems to be right now, we talked last week about how the U.S. is involved in this sort of now or never ceasefire push. That same process is still ongoing. So every time you hear a U.S. official saying, "Oh, we're really, really, really close now," well, like they've been saying that for months, and it doesn't really seem like there is much movement here. So there continues to be the same sticking points in the ceasefire negotiations, which is that Netanyahu specifically, not like the Israeli government generally, but Netanyahu specifically is insisting on maintaining Israeli control at the Gaza-Egypt border, the Philadelphia corridor, which Hamas has said specifically is a red line, like an inconceivable agreement. So like there's just no movement there, nor will there be. And there have been some good reports coming out lately, basically consolidating what we've already talked about, uh, that it's not really even about control over the Philadelphia corridor. It's that Netanyahu identified a thing that he could say that would allow him to sink the ceasefire negotiations. And he's been using it as a sort of justification um, to make sure that those negotiations don't go anywhere. Um, and that I think allows us to see some of the statements that he's been making in a little bit more context, where for example, he in a press statement earlier this week mentioned something about being like, okay, well, obviously there's a lot of pressure on me to push the ceasefire agreement forward, and the Philadelphia corridor is a sticking point, but it's possible that Israel would be willing to leave the corridor um, as part of the stage 2 of the ceasefire negotiations. So if folks remember, the ceasefire agreement exists in 3 stages. Stage 1 is the immediate cessation of hostilities and the release of vulnerable prisoners. And then stage 2 is the transition from that temporary truce into a permanent ceasefire. And so Netanyahu is saying that in stage 2, it's possible that Israel will withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor. But like Netanyahu's whole thing from the very beginning of these ceasefire negotiations has been that he only wants stage 1, right? He wants the hostages released, um, and then wants to go back to the military assault on Gaza. So he can really claim whatever he wants for stage 2, because he has no intention of actually getting there. And that's been abundantly clear. And so when like folks are basically accusing him of just wanting to hold onto the Philadelphia corridor for 6 additional weeks, it's like a sort of nonsense thing. Like, why are you willing to sink the ceasefire negotiation just for 6 weeks of control over the corridor? It's because it's not really about the 6 weeks, right? It's specifically it's the other way around. Like it's designed so that the ceasefire negotiations don't move forward. And I think I've probably talked your ear off enough in previous sessions about why Netanyahu doesn't want a ceasefire, but I'm happy to discuss that if folks want to ask any questions about it. And so like, a lot of pressure is going on Netanyahu related to all of this, but I think a key piece of it is, for all of the US's consternation about how Netanyahu is holding up a ceasefire, it's really clear how US policy has basically given him a green light to do that from the very beginning. This Jeremy Scahill article in Dropsite, I think, does a really good job of going through how from the beginning until literally today, the US continues to enable this sort of intransigence in the ceasefire negotiations, and why the US position is the thing that has made this ceasefire negotiation impossible. It's like easy to blame Netanyahu, but like he was always going to do what he was going to do. The question is why the US has allowed him to do that and continued to supply him with like the military equipment that allows him to continue this while being so intransigent on the ceasefire negotiations. Like history tells us every single time that Israel has gone like beyond what its sort of, US imperial master considers to be acceptable, there's usually a withdrawal of assistance or the threat of withdrawal of assistance that gets Israel to pull back. It happened in Lebanon, it's happened previously in Gaza, but it's not happening this time around. So, and that's why we're seeing a continued escalation as opposed to a meaningful reduction. And that's why the sort of arms embargo campaign, has never been more urgent. Meanwhile, there's a lot of pressure, I think, domestically here in the United States about how the U.S. has been managing this ceasefire stuff. There's supposedly, again, another Barack Ravid Axios scoop that Biden is going to present a new final proposal in the next few days. And that's going to be like the sort of last attempt to do this. This was a few days ago that it was published, and we still haven't really seen anything. It's not clear whether that's actually going to happen or not. And if it is, what's actually going to be in it. There is some talk about the US military playing a more direct role, but that's something that I find to be highly unlikely. There's a proposal being made for the US to take control over the Philadelphia corridor, for example, with EU monitoring. But whether that'll actually end up in there and whether the Biden administration is capable of offering a proposal that doesn't include any poison pills, I wouldn't hold my breath, particularly given that the last Biden proposal that was made ostensibly, Biden called it Israel's proposal, was rejected by Israel and accepted by Hamas. So uh, what happens with this next round of proposals is like hard to say, but it's not looking good. I think we'll know more in the next week or so, but I would say that what we're seeing is sort of like the dying gasps of the ceasefire negotiations. Meanwhile, hostages are pushing Biden to make a bilateral deal directly with Hamas, like going around Israel because Israel is clearly being intransigent and unwilling to negotiate. And so families of U.S. citizen hostages are asking Biden to go directly with Hamas, which he won't. Of course not. That's inconceivable. And even if he were inclined to do that, we'll come down to this later, but the Justice Department just made it like legally impossible. Meanwhile, the protests happening inside Israel around these failing ceasefire negotiations, have really reached a fever pitch to the extent that, folks are talking about this op-ed in Haaretz by a major general in the IDF or former major general in the IDF, basically saying that unless Israel gets out of Gaza, it's going to be the end of the Israeli state, which I don't disagree with. Although obviously the perspective there is very different than one that folks on this call would probably have. I think it is worth a read. And you can see sort of the old imperial boomerang thing that we've talked about a few times, where colonial acts of control end up sort of, boomeranging back to the settler colonial population themselves. You can see here these like giant protests that happened on Monday were being attacked by the like IDF's favorite tool of Palestinian crowd control, which is skunk water. This like incredibly horrible chemical that you basically can't wash off. This is the same stuff that the Columbia students got sprayed with, if folks remember, a few months back by those two IDF soldiers on campus, but now they're using it on Israeli civilians themselves. Meanwhile, for the arms embargo updates, there have been a few. Mondoweiss put out a great article last weekend about like the sort of legal underpinnings in terms of U.S. legal obligations for implementing an arms embargo. There's like, not only is it a thing that 4 out of 5 Democrats currently support, and I think a plurality of Republicans, like most people at this point are in favor of either an arms embargo or conditioning aid to Israel at least. Not only that, but it is also just like a legal requirement, like a domestic legal requirement, let alone international law. And so like that pressure, isn't making a lot of headway here, but it is making headway elsewhere. We are seeing the UK continue to suspend arms sales. As of this week, there have now been 30 arms licenses that have been suspended by the UK, maybe a little bit over 30. So 30 old contracts for the UK to supply weapons to Israel. And I think the UK is like the 3rd largest arms distributor to Israel, if I'm not mistaken. It's a big deal. It's a big step in the right direction. It's worth noting though that the UK has suspended 30 licenses, but there are a total of 300 arms licenses between the UK and Israel. So the other 270 some odd, I think it's actually a little more than that, are still going on. And so the UK government right now is sort of in this weird space of saying that offensive weaponry is not allowed to be shipped to Israel anymore, but defensive weaponry is. And defining what the difference of those two things are is like, as you can imagine, a basically impossible task. And that's why they're in this kind of weird middle space. This is the thing that I referred to a little bit earlier, that just this past Tuesday, the Justice Department has announced terrorism charges against senior leaders of Hamas. Honestly, I'm surprised they hadn't done this earlier. I think this is partly a result of what happened with the 6 prisoners on this past Sunday or Saturday. And, the fact that one of the prisoners that was killed in Rafah was a U.S. citizen, and, like the big outcry around that, his parents spoke at the DNC. But the charges are also like, among the other things in this Justice Department announcement is like, the charges against them include conspiring to use weapons of mass destruction, which like, it just feels like straight out of the Iraq playbook in a way that, you'd think they'd be a little bit more nuanced than this, but they continue to not be. It's just a very blunt approach that doesn't really effectively do anything. And obviously, this sort of terrorism charges thing is largely performative. It's not like senior leaders of Hamas were planning on vacationing in Florida anytime soon. But what it does do is make it harder for the US to engage with those people directly, say through bilateral negotiations or things like that, which they probably weren't going to do anyway. Meanwhile, on the US electoral front, I did want to point folks to this article in the Washington Post about Phil Gordon. We've talked about him a little bit before. He's Kamala Harris's like main foreign policy advisor, and the perception is very largely that this is a person who will shape a Harris administration's approach to Gaza going forward. I think that's a correct assessment. She does seem to like really trust his his analysis on what's going on there. I think it's important to hold two things here. One is Phil Gordon has been like super critical of the Biden administration's approach. He thinks it's largely failing and that we're not being like the United States is not being strict enough in its relationship with Israel, and that it's like that the US is being counterproductively willing to go along with what everything Israel does. That's a step in the right direction. And Phil Gordon is not our friend. Like his analysis, his perspective is pretty bad, all things considered. But he is a little bit more of like the realist school of foreign policy folks. So, I don't think he has like an ideological commitment to Zionism. He's clearly not going to get anywhere near where US policy probably needs to get, but it does represent a significant difference, and there are avenues for pressure in that direction, conceivably. I would encourage folks to read that article. I did find it really interesting. You'll get a little bit of both. Mostly you'll come out of it really frustrated with him. But I think there are some windows of opportunity there that's important to consider. Meanwhile, I think the Harris campaign approach to Palestine, as we saw, really solidified at the DNC, has been like wildly counterproductive to her own campaign. It's been like a real hit, I think, in terms of the ability of the progressive left to sort of back the Harris campaign in any meaningful way, to the point now where Republicans are putting out these sort of like fake ads as if they are like Zionist pro-Harris ads, So like they're doing an ad in Michigan right now saying Vice President Harris has chosen the right side. She made herself clear. She stands with Israel and the Jewish people. And when supporters for a free Palestine stood up for Gaza, Harris put them in their place. You can see like the very clever language here. So it's specifically designed to incense like pro-Palestine or Palestine solidarity folks into not voting for Kamala Harris. Like no real surprise here, and honestly, a fair accounting of her perspective. But like worth, I think, remembering that the right and like our enemies and whatever are not above using our own language as a way to sort of like weaponize, or like to influence the perspectives of folks on the progressive left. So an interesting development there. Two things that came out of like polling on the elections that I found particularly interesting this past week. Firstly, Michigan is cratering a little bit in terms of Democratic support, and the enthusiasm for Democrats has like collapsed after the DNC, which again, not super surprising to me. How much of that is a direct result of Harris's Gaza policies is really hard to say, but like it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't be related to that at all. A quick aside on the German elections, where the hard right, like fascist party in Germany won two districts for the first time since 1945, a really chilling sentence. And just to note that party is like a strongly Zionist party, despite the fact that it is like very explicitly an anti-Semitic party. There's some really good articles on that, including this one from the Left Berlin. Um, a quick note that campus protests are back. There have been some really incredible things I'm sure that folks have seen this past week, and a lot of really strong repression. It's clear that the campuses are more prepared this time to shut down student demonstrations. This wild guidebook that's being pushed out to every major university right now by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni lays out a series of like suggested academic policies to shut down encampments and occupations and punish students that are involved in them. There's a link to it in here if you want to see it. It's really chilling. Big week in BDS news, though. It looks like the Norwegian Wealth Fund, so like the National Investment Fund for the state of Norway, might be divesting in Gaza soon. We'll see in the next maybe week or so whether that comes to pass, but it seems very likely. And then here in the United States, Portland, Maine, the city passed a resolution divesting from Israel over its conduct in the Gaza war. This is a huge, huge development. Really hard to overstate the importance of this and the hope that this can be replicated in other large cities. So yeah, would encourage folks to read that article and learn more about what happened there. And then the big BDS win on the international front around this military cargo vessel that's trying to reach Israel with a series of like RDX explosives is like the key explosive needed for Israel for a lot of its munitions, is now like being blocked in multiple countries in a row. So like obviously through South Africa, and now also in Namibia, and there's a push for it to happen in Angola. On the BDS website, you can sort of track what's happening with that military vessel, which is pretty cool. And it's great to see that pressure sort of like building up. We're no strangers to block the boat. So in a quick summation, once again, it's worth remembering that the debacle that happened in Rafah this past week shows that like the IDF basically will never rescue another Israeli hostage. Like the terms of that process have fundamentally changed. So for this conflict to like move in any meaningful way forward, there has to be a ceasefire, and folks are clearly aware of that. But whether Netanyahu cares about the lives of those prisoners is suspect. The polio vaccination campaign is like reducing some of the violence that's happening in Gaza, but not by much and not nearly as much as it would need to for that campaign to effectively run across the strip. Ceasefire negotiations feel like they're sort of already dead, but are moving through their like sort of inertia. But I think in the next week or so, we'll sort of have a final take on how the ceasefire negotiations are going, maybe a few weeks. And yeah, so like Palestine stuff is clearly hurting the Harris campaign, it seems. It's really hard to say whether it's the Harris campaign that's hurting the Harris campaign or specifically Palestine. But at least that the BDS movement is really, I think, building some really powerful steam in the past few weeks. And hopefully that's something we can build on, particularly with the campus activism that's building back up in the next few weeks. A quick thing on upcoming events. Folks may know AROC Action has recently launched. It's a 501c4, basically a body that can make like political endorsements and more directly engage in political activity that typical like 501c3 nonprofits can't. So the launch of that body is next Thursday at Comage. So I really hope that folks can come. We'd love to see you there. Please also take a moment to follow AROC Action on Instagram, if you would. It is a brand new account. And it was already reported and suspended in its like first day of existence. So folks are really trying to keep it shut down. So we need your support to make sure that it stays alive. There are a lot of fascinating events happening in the next week. So I just put a few of them in here, but you should really just check out the AROC calendar to see them all. There's a lot of really cool stuff happening, including a series of fundraisers and some support for the Golden Gate 26. There's a new petition for freeing Palestinian politician Khaled Jarrar. Please take a moment to sign that. It just takes a second. And then, yeah, check out the calendar for those events. If you want text message updates, just text PSA to 833-633-0604. And check out the PAL Media Tracker for the articles that inform this analysis, although that also has been attacked recently, so we are it doesn't have as much information in it this week as it should. My apologies. I'm hoping to have it fixed in the next few days. And I think that's the end of it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Sammer. Before you go, just a note that about the Turkish woman that was essentially assassinated in the West Bank, and that you mentioned before, that she's also from the same peace activist movement as Rachel Corrie. And I think, unsurprisingly, to your other point about the Harris administration, sorry, the Biden-Harris administration, the Democrats not doing anything to sort of make things easier. I think Matt Miller's response was one of these very canned responses about deferring to sort of some period of investigation, right? That they're going to wait for the Israel, they're going to gather information and wait for Israel to likely do some investigation. And as we know from the past rhetoric coming from the White House spokespeople, including Miller himself, it usually amounts to very little in terms of a denouncement. It's usually vague, and it's certainly not as strident and as full-throated as when it has to do with the hostages or with Hamas. So something to keep note of there. Again, not, to your point, I think it's also very clear that it doesn't look like they're going to get out of their way anytime soon. And I do think that this will have some bearing on the next couple of weeks. The degree to which it is unclear, since it's sort of been par for the course. But um, again, thanks for helping us unpack all of that. As folks have asked, yeah, these links will be included in the post PSA email. We'll be back next week. Keep an eye on the event calendar, and we will look forward to seeing you all next week. Talk to you soon.